gentlemen, welcome to this week's edition of the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network and also at 21stcenturywire.com. We're live on X, Rumble, YouTube Live, as well as Facebook, and we're doing a beta test as well again this week on BitChute, another great platform. Great to have you with us for this special Sunday Wire edition. We've got a couple of great guests. We're going to be trying to delve into, unpack some of the biggest stories that are happening in Europe, in the U.S., but also internationally. Specifically, though, the bulk of this program will be discussing the situation in Syria in the Middle East. So we'll be joined by James Lee over in the second hour in Overdrive, and I'm really looking forward to that discussion. First time on the show, amazing media analyst, among other things. So looking forward to talking to James. But right now, we're going to go to the situation in Syria. And I want to welcome onto the program a very special guest. He is no stranger to global affairs, especially with regards to Syria. His name is Dr. Mohammad Marandi from the University of Tehran. He's joining us on the live link right now. It's great to have you with us, Mohammad.
Thank you for having me.
So much has happened over the last couple of weeks. I mean, I'm having trouble processing it because it's not just the events, Mohammed, but I might not be. I know I'm not exaggerating here. We're looking at the overturning of a civilization potentially, not just a country really, but a civilization. I've been to Syria. I've walked, the streets of Damascus and Aleppo and some of these places. I know you've spent time there as well. I mean, I want to get your reaction to what's happened this past week and a half, and your deep feelings about what's just taken place. But go ahead.
I've been to Syria many times since I was in high school, basically, and I've been to Syria after the dirty war began in 2011 many times. And the last time I was in Syria was actually after the war on Lebanon began. I was in Beirut during the first few days of heavy fighting and when Seyed Hassan Nasrallah was martyred. And I returned to Tehran through Damascus. So I was just there a few weeks ago. And it is something that I believed would happen. Over the last few years, Syria was going downhill, even though they had won this dirty war for the most part, and the terrorists were stuck in Idlib and other terrorists that the Americans were controlling, the ISIS tribes. They were near the Jordanian-Iraqi border still, but for the most part, the Syrian Arab Army won the war with the help of Iran, Hezbollah, and the Russians and Afghan volunteers. But after they won the war, actually, it was getting much worse, the situation, because the Americans wanted revenge. And so they imposed the Caesar sanctions. And the Caesar sanctions really destroyed the economy and crushed ordinary people. So Americans were occupying northeastern Syria, so they were stealing the oil and the wheat and the grains because that's the area where most agricultural products are produced. And so while people were suffering under these brutal sanctions, their oil was being stolen, their own agricultural products were being stolen. And then, of course, you had the Turks in the north, which were using ISIS and al-Qaeda to harass Syrians, but also forcing the army to spend a lot of wealth just keeping that part of the country surrounded, that area controlled by Turks and their terrorists, or Erdogan and his terrorists. So it was clear it is getting increasingly bad. And actually, when I was there last, and I was only there for a few hours because I was passing through from Beirut to Damascus airport to come back to Iran. And I spoke to friends, and they were saying things are not good at all, and that people just want to survive. Um, so I sort of felt I felt for years that that's where things will ultimately go in Syria. Or I mean, I didn't know when it would happen, but it felt like it was going downhill very fast. Iran's support for the Syrian government, by the way, has a number of reasons, but which are historic. Syria helped Iran when Saddam Hussein attacked our country, and so Iran was indebted to Syria. But also, uh, the Iranians uh, didn't get involved in Syria, by the way, in the fighting, nor did Hezbollah until 2013. And it was only after 2 years of this dirty war that they decided to go in, and that was because tens of thousands of foreign fighters had been brought into the country, ISIS and al-Qaeda and others. So when 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 Iran saw that there was this huge foreign fighting force, uh, mostly coming in from Turkey, some from Jordan, but mostly from Turkey, from across the world, they felt that they had to enter because ISIS and al-Qaeda was a threat to the region. It was a threat to Iran, and but the Americans and Europeans and countries in the Persian Gulf, these oil and gas-rich dictatorships, and of course Erdogan himself, they were all behind it. And of course the Israelis. The Israelis were supporting both ISIS and al-Qaeda alongside the occupied Golan. So the Iranians came in basically well after the dirty war began. And it wasn't because they didn't feel, they thought that the Syrian government was some utopian state. It was because they saw the terrorists as far worse than anything that existed in Damascus. Just as any of the Arab countries, which are almost, well, all of them are, none of them are democratic, and quite a few of them are very despotic. But I think it's fair to say that Iran would prefer any one of these dictatorships to an ISIS regime, whether in North Africa or in West Asia or an al-Qaeda regime. So that's why Iran stood with the Syrian government. And I must say that Trump supporters should feel the same, because when Trump came to power, after he began to fight ISIS, not for benign reasons. Not for benign reasons. It was after General Soleimani and the coalition that he had created from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq to fight against ISIS and al-Qaeda. It was after this coordinated counteroffensive was making progress that the United States saw Syria was retaking its territory, and it began fighting ISIS itself. Basically, it was a land grab. The Americans wanted to take parts of Syria so that they could hold that territory as to put pressure on the government, and they did that effectively. As I said, they took the oil fields and the agricultural heartland of Syria. But in any case, Trump was not fighting the Syrian government for the most part. He was fighting ISIS. That is the priority that Iran had from the very, very beginning. Fighting ISIS. ISIS and al-Qaeda were worse than the Syrian government, and their affiliates. All of them were worse than the Syrian government, whatever the Syrian government was. That was basically what Iran was doing. Now, these groups have entered Damascus, and we see elements of ISIS. We've seen the black flags of ISIS. We've seen the flags of al-Qaeda, and there are a host of other groups as well. It is a multinational army of different terror organizations that have come together. Many of them Chinese, many of them Uzbek, many of them from across Central Asia, even from Iran, some Europeans, an American, I know of a single American at least, and therefore it's a multinational terror group, and it's not going to end well for anyone when they come to power. And so ethnic cleansing, the slaughter of minorities or people who don't think like they do, they could be Sunni, but they could be severely punished and killed. This sort of thing is already happening. And even if Jolani wants to become or pretends to become more so-called, moderate, as they say, these terror groups and these terrorists, do you think they're all going to accept a new ideology now that they've come to power? Many of them are now drunk in their victory. They want jihad. They want to continue the fight. So this is not going to end well for anyone. It's not going to end well for the international community. But at least now that the Americans are happy about this victory, maybe they will declare the war on terrorism to be over, because it was al-Qaeda that carried out 9/11. And Jolani was a deputy of al-Qaeda in Syria. He was a deputy. He was also a deputy of ISIS at one point. And when he split from al-Qaeda, it was something that al-Qaeda accepted because it was for PR uh, and for attracting a Western audience. It was Western intelligence agencies that wanted to improve his image. Because when he did separate, he thanked al-Qaeda, and there were al-Qaeda officials there basically saying, yes, we accept to be separated. And he praised Osama bin Laden in this. I tweeted it a couple of days ago, the parts of the speech that he gave 8 years ago when he's supposedly separated from al-Qaeda. So now that al-Qaeda is acceptable, I think the Patriot Act should be repealed, and things should go back to normal.
Maybe it's a case, Mohammed, that Washington just felt we need to pacify al-Qaeda and ISIS and give them, Syria, Sham, and maybe they'll be happy and leave everybody alone. Maybe this is.
Oh, I'm absolutely certain that will happen. Just like in Afghanistan, actually. Back then, Osama bin Laden, the head of al-Qaeda, was praised in the West. If they'd done interviews with him. He was the guy who was fighting, or one of the people who was fighting the evil Soviet Union. And back then, extremism was a good thing because it was directed at the Soviet Union. In fact, as you probably know, the dirty war in Afghanistan did not begin with the Soviet invasion. It began with Brzezinski and Carter agreeing to give these radicals funding in order to. The objective was to encourage a Soviet invasion.
Yes.
And Brzezinski wanted to create a Vietnam for the Soviet Union. And it's interesting, the first takfiri books, the first educational books that were used by children in Afghanistan and Pakistan, which were school books full of hatred, the otherization of the Russians, the extremist ideology, the first school books that were producing this extremist ideology, they were published at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. So the first books on Wahhabism and Salafism that preached hate, school books, were produced in the United States for these people. I mean, this is all online. Anyone who's watching your show can go and look at these things up. So the Americans have a history of supporting and praising extremists, but then later on it comes back to haunt them. 9/11, for example, assuming that 9/11 was strictly an al-Qaeda thing. I used to think that was the case. I used to be skeptical about those who felt that it was more than just that. But after what I've seen in Gaza and the Holocaust and the complete lack of morality in the Western political establishment and among their intelligence agencies, I'm beginning to think that it was probably not all that simple.
Indeed.
And especially when we look at Netanyahu in Congress and how he advocated attacking Iraq and Libya and also Iran, I think that all these things, when you look at them, and the fact that the Americans were planning to invade country after country, according to what Wesley Clark said on, that's right? It's Wesley Clark.
General Wesley Clark. Yep. Yeah,
that's right. Him. So when you look at all that, I think it changes. You know, my view on 9/11 has changed. But even if we do accept the official narrative, then that's blowback. Then uh, supporting these extremists come back and haunt people. And the same is true in the UK. You saw these, al-Qaeda carry out what in the UK they called the 7/7 bomb attacks in London.
Hmm.
And then we had the Manchester bomb attack. The Manchester guy was was one of these al-Qaeda affiliate people who was cooperating, he and his father, with British intelligence, and he was in Libya.
That's right.
So, and Syria is much closer to Europe than was Afghanistan. So bringing this extremist entity closer to home may not be the greatest of ideas.
You said it in a recent interview. You said this isn't Islamic extremism we're talking about. You said this is American extremism.
Oh,
which
absolutely.
which
Absolutely.
I think this is an important point, and not just radical Islamist militants or Al Qaeda Mujahideen, but neo Nazis partnering with pretty much any extremist. There is a record here. There's pedigree here, isn't there? But explain that concept. I thought that was an important point you made. But go ahead.
Well, these extremist groups, their Salafist and Wahhabi ideology uh, came from the Persian Gulf regimes, and especially Saudi Arabia. And it used to be an obscure ideology from Najd. But then oil was discovered, and Saudi Arabia had more money, and they were allied to the United States, and they began to spread this ideology. And part of it was to counter Iran's revolution. So they tried to create divisions among Muslims, and by promoting Wahhabism, which is very hostile towards Shias, and they believe that Shias should be killed, that they're non-Muslim. They began to try to isolate Iran. So a lot of this Western-supported extremism was carried out with funding from the Persian Gulf. And they were in bed with Western intelligence agencies. As I said, in Afghanistan, that's where we saw it first used, but also literally a decade after 9/11, we saw them resurface again and cooperate with the West in Libya and then in Syria. And Qatar at that time was deeply involved in funding these groups, and NATO was fine with that. And in the UK and across Europe and North America, they were literally Western intelligence agencies allowing people to be recruited to go and fight in Syria. And in Libya too, but mostly in Syria. So the recruitments were happening across Europe and North America. And there's an example that I know of. One of my friends, his cousin, was influenced by these groups, and they were one of these groups, and they were encouraging him to go to Syria. And he went and told the police. And the police in London. In London, yes, and not just in London itself. And the police told him, you don't need to follow up on this, we'll pursue the case. And then again, after he saw that this was continuing, and this cousin of his was getting ready to go to Syria, to Turkey, and then from Turkey to Syria, he went and told them again. And they said, we know, just stay out of this. We know exactly what to do. And he went to Syria. And the same people who were recruiting him were recruiting others, and they continue to do so. So Western and Arabic intelligence agencies were all in on this. But the sad thing is that after these people go and then they carry out terrorist attacks in Europe or elsewhere, Western media and Western governments start pointing fingers at Muslim communities, where in fact it should be the Muslim communities that are pointing fingers at Western intelligence agencies and Western governments. But, that's not how it works. So as a result, racism and hatred is created. Societies become more violent and divided. But, we in throughout my life, what I've noticed is that human beings, as human beings, we're easily manipulated.
And you
And
mentioned,
it's not necessarily uneducated people or anything like that. We're all like that. We're all easily manipulated unless we are very careful and knowledgeable about what it is that we are looking at.
well, there's a certain narrative, a very seductive narrative. Go fight the good fight, fight against fascism, etc. This has always been used over history. Fight Putin in Ukraine, join the foreign legions, fight Franco in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, fight Bashar al-Assad. He is the kafir. He is the infidel. He's responsible for the suffering of Muslims. Sunni Muslims are suffering because of Bashar. Look at the White Helmets videos. Look at all these children under the barrel bombs of Assad. What an amazing international marketing campaign this was, Mohammed. And it penetrates deep, deep. And then I noticed, and having spoken to people in the region who get Hotbird satellite channels from all over, that all of this preaching from these Saudi and Gulf dominated mosques was penetrating people right across the Muslim
Absolutely.
world globally. So it's an incredible machine that really kicked into gear around 2011. And the results are hundreds of thousands of foreign fighters poured into Syria. The estimates I was told in Syria when I was there was 350,000, but some people have even told me the number is much higher over that 10-year period. And as you said, they ended up in Idlib after the Astana ceasefire agreement. You mentioned Trump before. I'm going to play this video real quick of him boasting about, on record, that he's responsible for stopping the offensive by Syria, Russia, and Iran and Hezbollah to take Idlib and deal with the terrorist problem. Here's this video by Donald Trump. I want to get your reaction to this. It's really extraordinary.
And Syria is a mess. And I was responsible, and I hope it stays that way, when I put out on social media a few weeks ago about Idlib Province. I said, don't do it. Now, I'll tell you, it happened where I was at a meeting with a lot of supporters, and a woman stood up and she said, there's a province in Syria with 3 million people. Right now, the Iranians, the Russians, and the Syrians are surrounding that province, and they're going to kill my sister, and they're going to kill millions of people in order to get rid of 25,000 or 35,000 terrorists or enemies of theirs, but I think we can call them terrorists. And I said, that's not going to happen. I didn't hear of Idlib Province. And I came back to New York, and I picked up the failing New York Times. I hate to admit it was the New York Times, but it was the failing New York Times. And I opened it up, not on the front page, but there was a very big story. I said, wow, that's the same story that the woman told me that I found hard to believe, because how would anyone do that with 3 million people? And it said that they were being surrounded, and they were going in and starting literally the next day, they were going to drop bombs all over the place and perhaps kill millions of people in order to get 35,000 terrorists. And I put out on social media and elsewhere, I gave Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, everybody these orders. Don't let it happen. I said, don't let it happen. That doesn't mean they can't be selective. They can't be, go in and they've got to do what they've got to do with terrorists, assume the terrorists, but don't kill millions of people. And it stopped. You saw that. Nobody's going to give me credit, but that's okay. That's okay, because the people know. I have had more Syrians thank me for that. This was about 4 weeks ago I put that out. I said, they're surrounding a city of 3 million people. They're going to start bombing the city. Don't let it happen. And I meant it, too. I meant it. And millions of people have been saying.
Mohammed, the reason this is extraordinary is because he's hung his whole campaign on I defeated ISIS. I'm the one who defeated ISIS, not the PMUs in Iraq, not the Quds forces, not Qasem Soleimani, not the Syrian Arab Army, not the Russian Air Force. Donald Trump said he defeated ISIS. But you have this admission on record just from a few years ago where he was boasting that as the coalition led by Syria and Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, to retake Idlib, to clear out the 30,000 ISIS, al-Qaeda, HTS fighters, he intervened to stop it because he said it would have killed millions of civilians, and we can't have that now, can we? Of course, it wouldn't have killed nearly as many as Israel has killed that we've seen in the last 14 months. But, you know, a quick technical point, Mohammed, before I get your reaction to this Trump video, but I read Operation Aleppo by Tim Ripley, writes for the Times, and he talked about the meticulous Russian air campaign, really specific, targeting terrorists. They avoided civilian casualties on an incredible operation. Took a long time, but they did it. So that proves that this idea that the offensive on Idlib at that time in 2018, 2019 would not have killed millions of people. It's a sparsely populated province. It would have been probably very successful, would have been difficult, would have been bloody, no doubt, but it could have been done. So I just think, to me, in terms of the historic record, if you want to lay blame on the current situation, you could easily lay it at the feet of Donald Trump. Go ahead.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he is always inconsistent. But on the one hand, when ISIS was losing, he joined the fight. As I said, it was basically for him a land grab. And in Idlib, when al-Qaeda and their affiliates were being defeated, he, by his own admission, intervened and blocked it. And let me give you a personal example. I was in Idlib. I was in West Idlib when East Idlib was, sorry, I was in West Aleppo when East Aleppo was liberated from al-Qaeda. And I was also in Mosul in Iraq the day after it was liberated from ISIS, right? So there was an air campaign in Aleppo, in eastern Aleppo, against al-Qaeda, and there was an air campaign against ISIS in Mosul. The air campaign in Mosul was carried out by the Americans, and it was horrific. When I went and saw different parts of the city, and I have footage of it on this cell phone, people were saying they're under all these buildings that were brought down. They're saying there are people under these. We haven't had we can't save them. It'll take us weeks, if not months, to find all the dead people. So the Americans were just bombing the city, whereas in Mosul, in East Idlib, Western media was saying how outrageous the Russians are and they're slaughtering people. And this, of course, I'm not speaking as a Russian, but I did compare. I did see what was going on in Mosul and what was going on and what happened in East Aleppo. And the American air campaign was more brutal and more indiscriminate. I can't say by far, but it was more brutal and more indiscriminate. But the point is that according to, based on Trump's admission, he prevented Idlib from falling, or at least being liberated, at least from our perspective. And therefore, he was supporting al-Qaeda and its affiliates. And its affiliates include ISIS too, especially after ISIS collapsed. A lot of them went and joined with these groups. If you recall, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed in an airstrike where? In Idlib. In Idlib.
In Idlib.
What was he doing there? He was under the protection of Jolani. You know, this is how, and his successor was also killed in Idlib. He too, I mean, if Jolani didn't know that the head of ISIS was in Idlib, which is not a very big place, then he really must be an incompetent leader. And there's no way that he could actually capture the whole country this way. But so they were protecting ISIS, the ISIS leader.
So the caliphate that everybody said couldn't happen, and we'll pull out all the stops to Raqqa, Mosul, straddling the Iraqi-Syrian border, and they say, oh, but and we defeated the Islamic State. No, the Islamic State, it did happen. It was called Idlib Province. That was the Islamic State that ISIS could not hold. They got it in the end. And I think what's happened over the last couple of weeks, Mohammed, is really should explain to everybody that about this story. But the worst part about it is that you cannot deny that the support that these terrorists in Idlib got from Turkey, from the UK, from France, from the Dutch, from the United States, from Israel, Israeli intelligence, from Qatar, from the Gulf states. Incredible amount of support, broad-based support. They're well-funded, well-trained, well-armed. They're well-fed. They get great salaries per month. They were able to maintain this army there, get it ready for the blitzkrieg that we saw the last couple of weeks. I mean, it's an extraordinary, and to call these rebels, this is another thing. A Turkic contingent from a Uyghur contingent from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Chechnya,
In China.
and China. How is this even? How could you even call this a Syrian revolution when it's clearly an army of foreign fighters, many from Central Asia? And I want to get your comment on this too. What Turkey is playing I mean, it's not like we haven't seen this in history. This is like going back now 1,000 years, using the enforcers from the Mongolian steppes. I mean, it's almost like history is repeating itself once again. But to me, it's extraordinary and horrifying too, because this is an Arab country, Syria, effectively. But it seems Turkey has other ideas, other plans for Syria. Your thoughts on this?
I wouldn't say Turkey, I would say Erdogan, because there are many Turks who've been very skeptical of his policies and opposed to his policies in Syria. And personally, I think that because in the West, we hear that the Iranians and the Russians are the biggest losers. But personally, I think it's actually the opposite. Those who've carried out this dirty war and who've captured Damascus, they're the ones who are going to pay a heavy price. I do not see Turkey or Mr. Erdogan as being able to manage Syria. They've destroyed Syria, and the Israelis have helped them destroy Syria, especially over the past few days. We saw the Israelis destroyed, and the Americans. Apparently, they've been using B-52s to destroy much of the country's military capabilities, the military industry, and their infrastructure. So Syria is a broken country, and the rebels or the extremists, they've basically gone into buildings and destroyed and looted, or just ordinary thieves who've used the chaos. They've gone into government buildings and institutions and plundered them, burnt them down. The country is in a very bad place right now, very bad. And then they're going to bring in these new leaders who are al-Qaeda to run the different government ministries. This is not going to work. And then you're going to need many billions of dollars. Qatar, I'm sure, will pay some to help these al-Qaeda forces. But are they going to pay to? I mean, it's different. It's very different when Qatar is funding Idlib than when it is going to fund the whole government. And then you have these competing factions within the movement, which are potentially at each other's throats. When they were in Idlib, they were constantly killing each other. They were constantly attacking each other. Now that they've captured the whole country, are they going to remain united? If Jolani says, okay, this is going to be a, let's say, hypothetically, he says, we're going to be an ordinary government now. Are these people going to accept what Jolani says? Are all these Salafists and Wahhabi factions going to say, okay, we're going to put down our arms and we're going to be teachers at high school, or we're going to become plumbers or engineers? I don't think so. So this is going to be a financial burden on Turkey. It's going to be a political burden. It's going to be a cultural burden, because Turkey has a strong Sufi component to its culture. Actually, it's very similar to Iran because of that. But this has gradually shifted since 2011. And we see more and more elements of Salafism and Wahhabism in Turkey over the last 13, 14 years, thanks to Mr. Erdogan and his alliances. Now that they are drunk in their victory, you can imagine the problems that could create for Turkey. But not just Turkey, for Jordan, for Egypt, for Saudi Arabia,
Lebanon.
for Lebanon. But Saudi Arabia is very important, because Mohammed bin Salman is unlike King Abdullah. King Abdullah presented himself, and the kings before him, as the champion of Islam, and they promoted Salafism and Wahhabism. And Mohammed bin Salman took a very different course. He chose a different path. He's secularizing society, and he brings in women dancers and singers for concerts and on the stage, doing what they do in the West. And a lot of these Salafists and Wahhabi, I mean, a lot of people would be unhappy, but the Salafists and Wahhabi components of that society will look to Syria and say, well, why don't we do the same thing here? So this has the potential to bring about instability across the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, but also Turkey itself. And the spread of these groups is a threat to China, it's a threat to Central Asia. But if and that's probably something that the Americans and the Turks and the Europeans and NATO want. But history has shown that these groups are not that easy to manage, and that ultimately you lose control, especially because they're so fragmented and they are so deeply divided among themselves. So I don't think this is going to be a win for anyone, actually, in the long run. I think the biggest losers are the ones who put their hands closest to the fire.
Would you say right now that they said, oh, freedom rang in Damascus and they're free of the evil Bashar al-Assad, but are the conditions not ripe for a really bloody civil war, potential breakup of the country? But really, if you think of all the factions and everything you laid out about the difficulty of governing, it's easy to march in with machine guns and pickup trucks, but then the business of governing a multi-ethnic, multi-tribal, multi-religious, pluralistic country, for all its faults, but it had a lot of very great qualities, difficult to manage, plus the cash injections, that's going to fuel corruption. Then the Wahhabist extremism. This is a very dangerous mix here. And what's to stop it, Mohammed, from spilling into Iraq again or into Lebanon, God forbid? And I'm sure Israel wouldn't mind if that happened. But what do you see potentially coming? And I'm not being a doom predictor here, but I'm being realistic. Your thoughts on this?
Well, first of all, if we go back and look at the different liberations that we've had, where freedom and democracy came and made society so much better, and the Western media was applauding the armed forces and Western governments for bringing this freedom to the people. One was called Afghanistan, another one was called Iraq, another one was called Libya. None of them turned out to be that good. Afghanistan is now controlled by the Taliban after trillions of dollars of money spent. Libya is a broken country as we speak. where many people want Gaddafi's son to take charge, and Iraq went through many years of great horror, and ultimately ISIS almost took the country when Iran stepped in and prevented the fall of Baghdad. So none of the actions of the Americans and their allies did any good for people. They just created mass destruction, mass chaos, and that's basically what Israel wants. And I would argue that all of these policies have been for the sake of the Israeli regime. Israel wants a broken Iraq. Israel wants a broken Syria, wants a broken Lebanon, wants a broken Jordan. He wants this region to be broken and in chaos, because that's how it maintains control. Even though this chaos is not to the benefit of Europeans, it's not to the benefit of anyone, because it causes flows of refugees, and the refugees from Syria alone changed the political map of Europe, a few years ago. So obviously, I'm sure they want these cheap workers, but the way in which they came in, and the same is true with Libya. So after the collapse of Libya and Syria and Iraq, you had and the sanctions against Iran and the dirty war in Afghanistan, you had millions of people go to Europe from Africa and West Asia. And that's causing Europeans to turn to the right and blame these people. But these people, going back to what we were discussing earlier, they're refugees because of Western wars, because of Western extremism or the dirty war in Syria. So they blame these Muslims, but if you look at it, if you look at Libya, a Western dirty war. If you look at Syria, a Western dirty war. If you look at Iraq, Afghanistan, invasions carried out by the West. So, or in the case of Iran, maximum pressure sanctions led that's not huge numbers, but significant numbers of people, Iranians, to leave for Europe. So it's not doing anyone any good. It's not in the interest of the United States either. But since it's in the interest of the Israeli regime, the West will, they will support these policies. That's why for the last 14 months we've been seeing a Holocaust in Gaza, and we've seen genocidal airstrikes on civilian targets in Lebanon, but the West didn't do anything about it. Even after the ICC gave arrest warrants to Netanyahu and his former minister of genocide, still nothing happened. No one sanctioned. No one stopped supporting and supplying the Israeli regime to carry out this Holocaust. So the West is willing to sacrifice its image, its credibility, its soft power for the sake of the Israeli regime, and it's really ready to carry out policies that create chaos, not because it's in their interest, but because it's in the interest of the Israeli regime. It's quite extraordinary.
And what's to stop this black flag, these people, gangs of extremists moving into Lebanon, starting with Tripoli?
They're already there.
And they are there. And
yes, they are there. Actually,
yeah, go ahead.
During the dirty war in Syria, Jolani sent a lot of terrorists into Lebanon. They occupied part of it. They occupied part of Lebanon, but they also carried out bomb attacks on different civilian targets in Beirut, killing large numbers of people.
Yep.
So the same Jolani who is now being, groomed as a moderate, multicultural jihadist.
So I think that the U.S., Israel would like to see that extremist Wahhabist Sunni faction somehow butting heads and going against Hezbollah and the Shiite community in Lebanon. And then everyone's taking sides, the Maronites, and then all of a sudden Israel's moving into the south again. It's almost like a repeat. Potentially you could see a repeat, maybe a slightly worse repeat than the Lebanese civil war. I mean, I feel like this is on the agenda of the United States. I'm certain Israel would love to see that. Your thoughts on
Absolutely,
the future of Lebanon and Hezbollah? Go ahead.
Yeah, but I think the problem is that it's not easy to manage these groups. As I said earlier, I don't think Jolani is in control. And Jolani could easily be killed if he goes in the wrong direction. And then many of these groups may also would like to go to Saudi Arabia or Jordan instead of Lebanon. How can Americans be sure that everything is going to be carried out the way they want it to be carried out? These people have a mind of their own. They have their own views. They have their own priorities. So this is not going, as I said, this is not going to end well for anyone. And I think it may not even go well. I mean, the only winner right now from this chaos is actually the Israeli regime.
Mm.
But if family dictatorships in the region that are in the American camp, if they become unstable as a result of this extremism, then actually the biggest loser becomes the Israeli regime, potentially.
And the other piece on this is it's almost as if you see Israel moving into the Golan Heights, almost ready to formally annex this area, wanting to, according to Druze population there in Sweda and this part of southern Syria, they're asking for the protection of Israel and strategic positions on Mount Hermon now. They have firing advantage and artillery. Damascus is within artillery range now for the IDF, as is a lot of Lebanon. But it seems like, Mohammed, that it looks like with the Americans and northeastern Syria, they could cut a path right to Iraqi Kurdistan. And then you're on the Iranian border at that point. Is this the strategic calculus that you think that they're attempting to do here, Israel? Go ahead.
It's quite possible. I mean, the coordination between Netanyahu and Erdogan is quite extraordinary, and I think I think everyone recognizes. I mean, Netanyahu took credit for the fall of Assad, which I think is itself something that should raise great suspicion among some people who are naive and actually think this was a good thing. And when we say it wasn't a good thing or a horrible thing, it doesn't mean that the Syrian government was a great thing. It's relative. This is worse because of who they are. And the fact that Netanyahu is taking credit, the fact that Biden is taking credit, I think is more than enough to show that this, therefore, is not in the interest of the people of the region. But yes, the Israeli regime is taking territory in the south, and these al-Qaeda groups, or HTS and their affiliates, so far they're saying nothing. They have not fought back. They have not protected the land. They have said, Jolani has said specifically that he's not going to have any war with the Israeli regime. So the regime that's occupying the country and slaughtering Palestinians as we speak and is bombing the infrastructure, they have no problem with it. What does that say about Jolani? I know there are a lot of people who are trying to justify all of this, and I've seen their justifications. But, it's clear as day where this is going. But, yes, they may push towards Lebanon. They may push towards Iraq. But, I can say that the General Soleimani's war on terrorism has had successes, even though Syria has fallen. One is that Lebanon is stronger today than it was back then. But even more importantly, Iraq is much stronger today than it was back then. Iraq now has the popular mobilization forces, and I believe that they could outgun these terrorists. And they are a formidable fighting force. And if they enter Iraq, Iran will definitely go to their assistance. So, as I said, I don't think that the Americans and Erdogan and Netanyahu control as much as they think they do. And the world that we live in is much more complicated than these people think. And one is one example is what happened in Syria itself. My understanding is that Turkey did not think that the government would fall in such a short period of time. Everyone was caught by surprise. And I think that Mr. Erdogan has bitten off far more than he can chew. And, the planning is one thing, but reality is something very different. They have created a monster. It's like Frankenstein's monster. They've created a monster that I do not believe that they can control.
And do you have any thoughts? I mean, I know you don't want to. There's a lot of people speculating about what happened in the final 48 hours in the fall of Damascus. How that series of events. There were the meeting in Doha, plus it seemed like things just basically fell apart very quickly. Have you had time to kind of think about this and order it in your head? Because there's a lot of people speculating about a lot of different things, but share with us your thoughts on that.
Well, the Syrian government distanced itself from Iran for the last few years, and they tilted towards Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. So there was a much smaller Iranian presence. But Iranian intelligence did tell Syria many times that things are dangerous. And they told them what's going to happen. But also, during the last few days, many things happened. And I don't want, and now everyone is, former President Assad is like the dead man. You can blame everything on him now. It's easy. But I think it was a combination of things. The Iranians were prepared to come in. But first, Syria did not invite Iran. Then it was becoming too late and things were falling apart. And also, but Iran did send troops. And then the Americans and the Israelis blocked the path. So there were troops there, but the Syrian army was collapsing. I can't speak too much on behalf of like what was happening with the Russians. Maybe some people in Iran know better. But I think also that it was just, not only, it was partially because the country was emptied out, the economy, the military, they were impoverished, generals made $40 a month, the terrorists made some of them up to $2,000 a month. And, but also, I think that people were bought off by the Americans, the Israelis, and Erdogan, and that they told them to step aside or not to fight at the appropriate time. And that's nowadays they do this through social media, and they pay people through Bitcoin and things like that. And you've heard recently that the Israelis have arrested a number of people who allegedly spied for Iran. I don't know anything about the case, but I've heard that in general these things nowadays happen through social media and they pay people through Bitcoin. I know that's what they do in Iran. When the riots were taking place in Iran 2-3 years ago, this is how they would get people to carry out some sort of attack on a building or burn a car, or do something violent and film it, and then they would pay them through social media. That a lot of people were arrested as a result because they were caught on camera or the police saw them, they take them, and then they'd find out that this is how it was done. So I would imagine the same model would have been used in Syria, but much more effectively because the country was so poor and the country was broken. So I think it's a combination of things: betrayals, indecision, poverty, and then the Americans and the Israelis coming in to block the Iranians. But I can't speak on behalf of, again, the Russians, but Iran cannot fight a war if the Syrian army is not willing to fight. You can't fight for another country. It doesn't make sense, and it's not going to work, and it would be too costly. So, we won't find out the whole story for a very long time. I'm sure there are many stories, inside stories, but they'll probably come out gradually. We'll have to see one day what Mr. Assad himself says
Mhm.
in Moscow, he'll probably, after a period of time, start putting out his version of events.
Yeah, because we didn't see any address to the nation before he left, not after. Still waiting. So that vacuum of speculation is going to get filled with a lot of different ideas and claims and rumors in some cases as well. But I think you're right, and this is a confluence of events, and things happened very quickly. The collapse happened very quickly for all the factors that you mentioned. The details of that, sure, we could learn a few things here and there, but it is a really extraordinary thing. What it shows, though, Mohammed, is that if you didn't want to have an ISIS al-Qaeda invasion of Damascus, and then you would have removed the sanctions from Syria, you would have supported Syria in their war on
Of
terror,
course.
but that didn't happen. The
You
opposite
know,
happened.
the whole thing, and sorry for interrupting, the whole thing about Assad killed his own people, or he killed hundreds of thousands of his own people. No, they killed the people of Syria. They killed the people of Syria through sanctions, brutal sanctions, which destroyed families, just killed people, impoverished people, caused children to grow up with malnutrition, and through a dirty war. It's, when they say he killed his own people, the people fighting him were ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jaish al-Islam, and all these other groups. So if it's not as if he was just sitting there killing people one by one. This was a dirty war. If the dirty war didn't happen, at worst, Syria would have been a dictatorship like Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
Would have
or
been just,
an autocracy. It's more like it's a single party state, so it's more like an autocracy,
yeah,
but
at worst. But
not, yeah, not as
they
extreme.
destroyed the country,
Mm.
just like Afghanistan. Afghanistan before Brzezinski and Carter got involved. Afghanistan, even though Iran was selling a lot of oil back then, some of its numbers for healthcare and education were better than Iran, and in some indicators in Iraq were better than Iran. So these were two countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, that were doing pretty well in the 1970s, and the Americans destroyed them. And Syria is even worse. Libya too. Libya was had the highest standard of living among all African countries, and they destroyed it. So the United States and the Europeans, their history in our part of the world has been very dark indeed. And the main reason, part of it is empire, part of it is control, but I think this specific type of behavior is due to the fact that the Israeli regime wants chaos. They want instability in order to maintain domination and hegemony.
So, given all that you said and what all we said, can we call the current government in Damascus? Can we call them a regime? Do they raise to the level of regime, or are they any less of a regime, quote unquote, than the previous government in Damascus? Go ahead.
I don't think it's really much different from the ISIS regime. Jolani has been given a good PR team. The West has been helping him, especially CNN in particular, over the years to make him an acceptable figure and now even a hero. But his organization these are the same people who've been carrying out this dirty war for the last decade and a half almost, or over a decade now. These people haven't changed, and it's not one organization either. It's different organizations. They've only come together to overthrow the Syrian government. I think they didn't even expect that. I personally think they had no idea they'd get into Damascus. But I don't think that I don't think that this regime or this terror entity will be able to govern over Syria in the long term.
And one last question, one last point, and I think you can speak to this. There's what I've seen in the last couple of weeks is a real emphasis on sectarian narratives, Sunni versus Shiite, Sunni and Alawite, and the Sunnis were repressed in Syria, and now they're free. And on, I'm not going to single out any media outlets, but let's just say Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye. These are Qatari funded outlets. A lot of the pundits strongly pushing sectarian narratives, and Americans as well. They're kind of doing a victory lap. That it's to me, I think this is very dangerous. This was almost somehow slightly under control before. Now it's going a bit wild, and it does worry me because I know the direction that this type of attitude and this type of rhetoric it leads to, and it's not. I don't think it's a very positive direction, and can lead to in disaster. But have you noticed this yourself, and then your thoughts on the imposing of this sectarian narrative over everything in the region? Go ahead.
Oh, absolutely. It's clear as day. It's divide and rule. It's how certain factions gain power. Hezbollah made the most extraordinary sacrifices for the people of Gaza. They lost so many people in order to force the Israeli regime to shift its resources to the north. It willingly gave thousands of martyrs, including many women and children, if not the majority women and children. I don't know the exact numbers, but they gave the Lebanese community, because the Hezbollah supporters were the targets. They were targeting communities and families that were supporting Hezbollah. The Israelis were constantly bombing homes. Whenever they lose on the battlefield, they slaughter people in both refugees. They'd seek them out, and communities that were loyal to the resistance or supportive of the resistance. So they gave thousands of martyrs for the sake of Gaza, to save the children of Gaza. And then this group, which Jolani, he's saying that he's not going to fight Israel, and that his enemy is Hezbollah and Iran. And he's allowed the Israelis to destroy the country's infrastructure and the defense capabilities and occupy large parts of the country, but it's Iran that's the bad. The Iranians are the bad guys. So what does that say? Yet, despite all this, we see very, very sectarian rhetoric. And the reason is because since they cannot defend these terrorists through objective discussion and debate, they use people's emotions to keep people on board and to support them, despite all the evidence that these people are in bed with the enemy and that they've done a deal with the devil many years ago.
And the same people are saying that Syria never did anything for the Palestinian cause, for the people of Palestine, that somehow they were working in cahoots with the Israelis. I mean, your perspective on Syria's role in that resistance against the Israeli occupation, subjugation, you could call it. How would you respond to that type of a charge?
I think these people know quite well that Syria, despite all its shortcomings and its problems, it allowed aid to get to the West Bank. The aid that went through Syria to Jordan. The Jordanian intelligence and the Jordanian military tried to block it, but there was aid going through Syria to Jordan, and from Jordan to the West Bank to support the resistance there. And then the support for the resistance in Lebanon. And to a degree, support for Gaza in their own very complicated way. You had Palestinian groups in Damascus, which now apparently they've been forced to disarm.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Syria is not like Iran or Hezbollah or Ansarullah. But right now you have a leader in Syria that says we don't have any, we have no problem with Israel. We're not going to get into a fight with Israel. Even though it's occupying more and more of our territory, even though it's very close to the capital, and even though they're bombing us day and night, we have no, uh, quarrel with the Israeli regime. As the genocide continues and as people are being slaughtered right now in Gaza.
And that's probably the most extraordinary thing of all. And Turkey, Erdogan talks a really big game against Israel. He really whips up the crowd, but
And he transports half of the country's oil bought from Baku, cheap oil. He has diplomatic relations, and senior intelligence officers have been going back and forth all the time. And also, ordinary trade continues despite the claims that that's not the case.
so just lastly, what is Iran's main concern from the Iranian perspective, based on what's happened last couple of weeks? What is Iran most concerned about? Where are its priorities right now?
I think for Iran, the main issue will remain the Israeli regime, that it is the root reason, the root cause for all the instability in West Asia and North Africa. As long as we have a ethno-supremacist genocidal regime occupying Palestine, it isn't, and which has the full support of the West, there will be no peace. And therefore, pressure must be maintained on the regime. It must continue to be exposed to the world. The world must see it for what it is. And by the way, even though I fully acknowledge that the Israeli regime uh, has at least won this battle, they're the big winners in Syria, without a doubt. Right? It's not Turkey. Turkey has made a big mistake, or Erdogan has made a big mistake, and Turkey will pay a price, sadly, because I love the Turkish people. They're very, they're pro-Palestinian. But anyway, um, the biggest winner I acknowledge is the Israeli regime. But, and many will not agree with me. But I continue to believe that the Israeli regime has lost this war, in the sense that it is now seen across the world as an illegitimate racist regime that carries out genocide. It can no longer hide behind the Holocaust or the slogan of anti-Semitism. People don't believe these things anymore. No, people are much more educated than before. They're seeing what's happening, even though it's not in the news anymore and everything is on Syria. And I'm sure that they're very glad about that, and so is Western media. Are very glad to turn attention away from Gaza and exaggerate everything about Syria, just as they exaggerated about Libya, and just as they exaggerated about when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and we remember the incubators and all that. I'm sure they're glad that they distracted attention away from that. But the world has learned a lot about the Israeli regime over the last 14 months. And I don't see it ever recovering. It is seen as a genocidal regime. And Israelis, wherever they travel, people are going to remember that. And people who go to, who are told, why don't you go to Israel? They're going to think about that. And in future, I don't think that a lot of people want to invest in the regime. So I think that the Israelis have been hit very hard, but they've also scored some points, and those were basically thanks to Mr. Erdogan.
Dr. Mohammad Marandi, University of Tehran, really appreciate you joining us on the Sunday Wire this week.
Thank you for having me.
That was an absolutely incredible interview. Big thank you to Dr. Mohammad Marandi from the University of Tehran. A lot to think about there, a lot to take on board. We're going to try to maybe unpack more of this story a little bit in the next segment, but also in the coming weeks. I'm going to be talking to more people with really direct insights into the region, many of who are on the ground in the region as well. So again, this conversation isn't going to end just because the headlines might be cooling down over Christmas, although I don't think they will be. It's absolutely incredible what has been transpiring over the last couple of weeks. What we're going to do right now is take a break here on the Sunday Wire. Thank you again for joining the live stream here on X and also on Rumble, on YouTube Live as well, Facebook, and our new stream we're testing out still on BitChute. So it's great to have you with us again. Take a short break right now with the Sunday Wire and listen to the music of Joseph Arthur. We'll be right back in a few minutes.